Welcome to all of you who are watching us from on behalf of the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement and Water Policy Center. It gives me a great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished chair, Dr. Peter Chang Chai, speakers and participants who registered for the event. We are so glad that you could join us today at the NIICE WPC International Conference on Post-Pandemic World Order Navigating the New Normal. Throughout the 3 days, conference will be having 30 sessions, and that will be taking place at 2 Zoom rooms simultaneously. We have around 150 experts and speakers joining us from 30 different countries who will be delivering their presentations and sharing their expertise with us. This is the 17th session of the conference. To chair and moderate this session, it's a real pleasure to have Dr. Peter Chang Chai here with us. Dr. Peter holds his doctorate from Harvard University, master's from Princeton's Theological Seminary, US, and bachelor's from King's College, London. His area of expertise are comparative philosophy, political theory, and political philosophy, comparative religion, and social sciences. He has published several books such as Chinese Religiosity in a Post-Marxist China and a Post-Border World, Bishop Joseph Butler and Wang Yang Ming, a comparative study of their moral vision and view of conscience. Without any further ado, let me request Dr. Peter to chair the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafia. Thank you so much. Thank you to NIICE as well for inviting me to be part of this very interesting 3 days conference, I think. We are in session 17, and I already got a chance to get to know some of the speakers in this session today, Shrabana, Reena, Athulasiri, and Mono just now. So I don't think, because we are on a very tight schedule, so I don't want to spend too much time in terms of introduction. There's information that you need on the speakers or in the programs. So I will just go right into the program proper, and we have about 15 minutes for each speaker. Then hopefully at the end, we will have about 30 minutes of Q&A, okay? So today we have first speaker for us today is Dr. Reena Marwah, Associate Professor at Jesus and Mary College. And Dr. Reena's title for today's presentation is Contemporary Geopolitics, Optics for ASEAN. So I will give about maybe 2 minutes before the 15 minutes is up. I will just wave a little bit, just a signal, okay?
Thank you.
Right.
I think we need that all the time.
All right, Reena, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Dr. Jaiswal, for inviting me for this panel discussion. I'm delighted and privileged to speak in this session, particularly chaired by Dr. Peter Chai, Deputy Director, University of Malaya, and wonderful to know you, Dr. Peter. So I would be providing the context and overview of the prevailing situation in Southeast Asia in a very limited way, but through two main, sort of sections. First, a brief overview and focus on contemporary geopolitics, which I think everyone is aware of in this room, including, of course, China's visible aggression in recent months. And secondly, I will try to articulate possible options for ASEAN countries, both in the domain of geopolitics, which is concomitant, of course, with geoeconomics. So in the present times, China's charm, offensive, and economic diplomacy, as well as its own proximity to authoritarian regimes, has certainly downplayed territorial dispute while focusing on economic relations with Southeast Asia, both through trade and investment, especially in BRI projects. This has inevitably resulted in an expansion of political and security linkages. With a population of over 600 million people and a growing middle class, ASEAN is an important partner, of course, for China, but also for several other powers, which includes India, USA, EU, Japan, and Australia. But China's rise certainly is unstoppable. For Xi Jinping's China, both 2021 and 2049 are Centennial Goals. By 2021, as we all know, to celebrate the CPC's centenary, and this, of course, is just knocking on China's door. So the goal is for China to build a moderately prosperous society in all respects. By 2049, the centenary of the People's Republic of China, the goal is to build a modern socialist country that is prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, and harmonious, of course. And these goals are very well enmeshed in the present postures of China. Hence, while the rest of the world, as we know, is preoccupied with its own internal problems and issues of reopening the pandemic-ravaged economies, China is flexing its muscles not only in the South China Sea, with even ballistic missiles at all, a new security law in Hong Kong, its fighter jets entering Taiwan's airspace. But of course, there is pushback from the United States, from UK, from Taiwan, and there's also a digital push that is happening. So we also find that experts in the United States have been nudging their government to think about asymmetric ways to challenge China's so-called aura of invincibility especially around the South China Sea and in East Asia, including increased intelligence sharing with regional partners. And this is, of course, now visible with America's aircraft carriers and spy aircraft also being seen in these waters. Moreover, the expansionist position of the Chinese in the Himalayas has further brought Japan, UK, France, Australia, ASEAN, and the United States to back India. This global support for India has, of course, responses from China in terms of playing the victim card, calling out India as the aggressor and others as interfering in the internal affairs of China. Hence, to further elucidate on what these transformations in the global arena imply for ASEAN and the individual countries and the way the situation is unfolding, I'll go to the second part of my presentation. It is very evident that Southeast Asian countries are highly concerned about the fragility of the present world order. Many among them are also adversely affected by the pandemic, especially countries which are relying most on tourism like Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore. It is a new normal, in fact, that China and the United States are now locked in a struggle for international primacy, and the result of this contest will shape the world order, not just for the next 10 years, but probably for generations. In one interview to the BBC just a few days ago, Kishore Mehbubani, who is the author of Has China Won? He said that China and the United States must speak to one another, and he, as several other experts they are worried about even a possibility of a small war in the South China Sea, even as the elections draw closer in the United States. And what he felt was that, in fact, this very risky option may be Trump's only hope for re-election. Now, that was a tall statement. Given the fact that China's GDP, according to the IMF, will still increase by 1%, while countries as the United States experience a decline in GDP of about 8%, Mehbubani's book, Has China Won?, truly holds water. Further, I would just like to say a few facts about the Asean-China Partnership before I go further. First, ASEAN has already become China's second largest trading partner in 2019, with trade valued at almost $650 billion. And all countries have huge inwards investments from China. China has several institutional arrangements with ASEAN countries. Moreover, they follow a very similar business culture. And of course, for each country, China is a neighbor, a very important neighbor that must be engaged. Secondly, China has an FTA with ASEAN, yet the RCP, the mega trade deal, is expected to be signed in November this year, minus India, because India walked out of this deal in November last year. It's interesting to note that, in fact, ASEAN is at the center, all about. It's at the center of almost 245 trade agreements negotiated or under negotiation. The third point here is that we all know about the 2016 ruling, which came in favor of the Philippines President Duterte, but he looked away. And that is after which China started increasing its building of the islands in the reefs and shoals in the South China Sea. Fourth, China's role in influencing the polity and elections in all countries in Southeast Asia, emerging authoritarianism in Southeast Asian countries like the Philippines. We also know about the Cambodia situation, and of course, the Thailand Prime Minister also won office in a managed election after having headed the country's military junta he won in 2019. Since the coronavirus began, the region has been witnessing changing alliances, reworked supply chains, a new economics, along with the resurfacing of disputes, which were hitherto considered having an inconsequential effect on the Indo-Pacific region. The importance of the theory of balance of power has been reinforced by the pandemic responses by the great powers in areas of foreign policy. Today, economic statecraft is readily employed in response to territorial disputes, while sales of defense equipment can be considered a proxy for close alliances. On these aspects, a few micro facts have emerged from surveys conducted by the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in 2019 and 2020, with all their respondents being eminent people who sort of also influencing in the countries. So through these surveys, there are a few points that I would like to draw the attention of this audience to. Firstly, China continues to be the most influential power in the region, with 79% stating this in 2020 compared to 73% in the previous year. So this influence has increased. China's economic stranglehold, as we know, has further solidified. Out of those who believe in this, there are 2/3 who are also worried about China's rising economic influence, and this is particularly highest in Philippines, Vietnam, and Thailand. 38% of the respondents consider China as a revisionist power. Only 7% actually believe that China will maintain the status quo. And almost 2/3, in fact, over 2/3 in Myanmar and Thailand have little or no confidence in the BRI initiatives. When ASEAN was asked to choose between China and the United States, it's interesting to note that almost 54% chose the United States as against 46% for China. Additionally, Japan, the European Union, and to a lesser extent, Australia, emerged as the preferred strategic partners of ASEAN. And we understand, of course, how Vietnam has very recently inked an FTA with the European Union. The Quad finds the greatest support in Philippines, Vietnam, and Myanmar, and as expected very well, Cambodia and Laos are completely opposed to it. Japan and the European Union are considered the most reliable partners in the future. In terms of language, ASEAN countries preferred English, and English got a rating of 95% of people, but Mandarin also scored at almost 40%, especially in Singapore, and almost 50% people in Malaysia. With respect to the issue of trust, Japan has emerged as the most trusted power in 2020, 61%, followed by the European Union, 39%, the United States at 30%, and China and India both at 16%. So Japan continues to retain its #1 position from 2019 and in 2020. So therefore, to conclude, with Vietnam as the chair, we know that for the first time, the present ASEAN statement reaffirmed the 1982 UNCLOS. After several years, in fact, there has been a collective response. And of course, it is under the watchful gaze of the United States that China has been building on the reefs and shoals in the South China Sea. As far as the Indian Ocean is concerned, India is also beefing up security in the Andaman Sea. In the ultimate analysis, what I would like to emphasize is, if I have a minute, first, ASEAN countries cannot escape their reliance on China, but they would like to engage with a concert of countries keeping their sovereignty intact. Second, ASEAN seeks a rules-based order, but it also understands that China will not adhere to any rules. However, it will continue to engage China on a binding code of conduct. Third, there is an implicit understanding that despite bilateral differences, ASEAN as a grouping must remain resilient, united, as only then can there be an ossification of collective strength for shared peace and prosperity. And lastly, with respect to China, as we know, several BRI projects have been renegotiated. We do know that there is a pushback to some BRI projects in Malaysia too that has happened. But China's pace of growth may get impacted for some time, and its cassia being expelled for exposing domestic serious political problems has certainly not helped. Thank you very much, Dr. Peter.
Thank you, Reena. Thank you so much. Your review really resonates with me. I mean, we do register all that you have already presented. It's a very delicate relationship that we have, ASEAN as a whole with China. So we certainly would like to pick this up, getting further this conversation during the Q&A if we have time, and I do have some questions to follow up on your presentation. It's very helpful. Thank you so much, Reena. I want to make time now for the other speakers, and we'd like to invite now our second speaker, Shrabana Barua, Research Associate at the GNU University, India. And Shrabana's title for today's presentation is Infrastructure and Influence, the Case of China in Myanmar, another case study related to ASEAN. So Shrabana, the floor is yours. Please unmute, Shrabana, we can't hear you.
Sorry,
Yeah.
yes. Thank you, Dr. Chang, for that
Yes.
introduction, and thank you to NIIC for having this interaction over the past 3 days. And without wasting time, I apologize for not having a presentation also because most of my work is also due for submission next year, which I didn't want to put in writing, but I think this is going on record. So if anybody has questions or any doubts, can reach out to me later. So the title is Infrastructure and Influence, which I have sort of borrowed from a paper by Jonathan Hillman for CSIS that he had written in 2019, which was called Influence and Infrastructure. But why I chose to put infrastructure before influence is because what I believe is that if you are to have a sort of influence that China is aiming for particularly, and this whole great game and so on that we keep talking about, infrastructure, I believe, is one of the sectors that needs the most investment, the most attention, and that is something that China has recognized and straight away dived into, not just since the pronouncement of the BRI in 2013, but even before that. And the case of Myanmar really brings that point out, and I will try and briefly put my ideas in 2 or 3 sections, starting with why infrastructure, going on to what sort of influence are we talking about, and then speaking a little on China in Myanmar in terms of the projects that it is carrying on. Back a little back in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher was speaking to an audience in London when she said that you might have heard a lot lately about infrastructure, the new in word. Some of you might even ask exactly what it is. You and I come by road and rail, but economists travel by infrastructure. At the same time, just a few months apart, in September 1984, the Vice Minister of Communication in China had written an article published on 2nd September in the Beijing Review, where he spoke about the need to reach out to the Indian Ocean through Myanmar. It's a very popular article now that scholars refer to every now and then when they are talking about China in Myanmar in terms of infrastructure. But at that point of time, it went pretty much unnoticed. But what we realized is at that time, in 84 itself, infrastructure was so-called an in word in the West. And that is when China was already talking about linking the southwest of China through Myanmar, particularly Yunnan and Sichuan, so that they could reach out to the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal, for 2 or 3 reasons. The most popular that people bring up is the Malacca Dilemma, because China, most of its resources in terms of oil and gas and all of that, energy resources goes through the Malacca Strait, which China thinks at any point of time, if anybody clogs it, will definitely be a problem for them. So firstly, obviously, is because to overcome the Malacca Dilemma. But secondly, I would also argue is to sort of create an influence that they have held, especially after 1988 on the Tatmadaw in Myanmar. They have linked, they have had bridges, construction of roadways, railways, that sort of gave them a direct as well as an indirect influence on Myanmar. I will speak about this at the latter part of my presentation. But coming to why infrastructure, so I feel that not too much has been written directly on infrastructure in IR. There's a very interesting book called The Tools of Empire by Daniel Hedrick, who speaks about how the British Empire and colonial rulers used to invest in infrastructure, especially rail lines, telephone lines and communications, so that they could harness the gains out of that to not just trade, but also to have an influence over that host country. And that is something which is happening even today. It's not just to directly increase your trade, definitely that's an impact, but influencing through the means of infrastructure is also what China is doing today. And it has recognized that infrastructure could be a tool of influence much earlier. A McKinsey, a Global Institute report also says that a country which has more linkages in terms of connectivity, in terms of trade, global flow of people as well as data, is up to 40% more progressive. It does better. And then countries which are less connected. So again, infrastructure, investing in any sort of infrastructure that way has emerged as beneficial even for other sectors. And coming directly to investing in infrastructure of types that make access to people of goods and services is, the pipelines and roads and airports and all of that. And the ADB, a recent ADB report had stated that in Asia, we would need about $1.7 trillion if we are to overcome our infrastructure gap by 2030. And 1.7 trillion is a lot of money. And I think China again has, because it recognized the fact that infrastructure is a sector that is so wanting for, investment, it has done absolutely that, especially after the BRI was announced and in 2007 when it was put into the constitution. So that is why infrastructure is important. The second part of it is of my presentation, I'm going to speak briefly and borrowing quite a bit from, in fact, Jonathan Hillman's paper, because I found that so relevant, is how is that influence actually coming about through, obviously, if you invest in linkages, creating these big projects, there is some sort of influence, but how exactly is that happening? So he suggests that there are three ways. One is through financing, at the stage of financing. The second is at the stage of designing and construction. And the third is at the stage of ownership and operation. If we look at financing, he says that Jonathan Hillman's paper says that it actually allows you to extract some sort of diplomatic concession at the financing level, besides gaining operational control and shaping the project as and when you like. But when we talk about finances, it's interesting to note a few differences in the way China finances through their bilateral means, where vis-a-vis how China finances through a multilateral body, for example, the AIIB or the ADB. The ADB has certain guidelines which states, for example, that it will not have a stake ownership of more than 25% in a project, whereas the China Development Bank, which does so much of this infrastructure financing, has no such clause in it, which means that they can own they can have up to 80% stake or more if they wish to. For example, in the Hambantota port, we saw exactly that they had up to 80% stake. Secondly, there is also a clause, a guideline, so to say, in the ADB way of functioning, that they would not be usually the largest single investor. China has no such clause, and it usually is the largest single investor to push away any sort of competition that's there. So these are few technical things through which China is actually on ground having the sort of influence that that infrastructure otherwise gives. Moving on to another way of how it's doing it is obviously the fact that it's usually the investments are being done by the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises. And in Myanmar, it's very much evident in all the major projects, particularly the ones within the BRI discussions or even beyond, are done by the SOEs, whether it's the CNPC, whether it is the CITIC, and so on. So the way the SOEs are something that have the center, the CPC directly has a big hold over what is going on on ground. Another way, and again, this is something that has been discussed through scholarly articles, reports, and projects, is obviously what we all know, that China actually insists on having their own people working on the ground vis-a-vis local people. And this was an issue even in Myanmar, even when they were building up the CPEC. So these are some of the ways that actually influence is being done through infrastructure. Coming to the design and construction level, Hillman's paper again talks about how the design makes a difference, because it, the kind of technology you're transferring to that particular country will depend on the design, and then China could then transfer the technology they want to. And we have had the case of the headquarter in African Union, where there were reports that the African Union headquarter being built were filled with chips, which was transferring data to Shanghai at some point of time, and this was a big controversy. But even when we talk about Myanmar, this is again something back in the 90s. There was a bridge that was being built from 91. It was completed in 92, which was across the Ruli Muse Bridge, it's called, which later was known as the Gun Bridge, because there were a lot of guns and ammunitions being transferred through that bridge and another bridge for the Tatmadaw. So China actually was not just directly influencing, but providing the military with a lot of ammunitions and arms and hard power, and which obviously then translate translates to the sort of influence that it desires. But Bertil Lintner, in one of the articles in '92, had written that what Myanmar had actually requested was simply a 20-ton bridge, but China insisted on a 50-ton bridge, and it actually persisted. Now there is a 50-ton bridge that's there. This actually is a sort of influence or power that traditionally Dahl talks about, A having a power over B, and B not wanting and yet giving in. So you can see directly how that influence is being played out. And the third that Hillman talks about is ownership and operation, that it can restrict or deny competition or access to when you have ownership, and the way you operate it after you have built. This is mostly evident in Hambantota, but if we come to Myanmar, we also see most of its project, especially the Chokpu. It sort of had an ownership of 80%, which was then brought down to 70% in 2017. The oil and gas pipelines that are going on from Chokpu up to Yunnan, both of them have a 51% ownership. So definitely more than half of ownership is with China, which speaks of the, they do have that leverage to then influence it in ways that they want to. So with this, I'll just conclude, coming directly to the point where China is influencing Myanmar, the case study. I wouldn't say China literally started influencing back in the 1950s through infrastructure. That happened gradually after 1988 particularly. But having said that, it did realize the need for having railways and roadways and highways much earlier than so many other countries or great powers. In the 1990s particularly, China began to revive the old Burma Road, for example, which had historical meaning and importance. And through revival of that Burma Road, or the Lido Road, the other part of it is also known as the Stillwell Road in Assam, up to Arunachal. And so while actually building or rebuilding this road, China sort of brought out a diplomatic factor also, that see, this road is important and hence we are building it, because all I'm trying to say, it was significant in a more diplomatic way also, rather than having practical usage per se. So the influence was not always direct, but also indicating certain things, that infrastructure is important. Similarly, there were bridges being built, like I mentioned, the one in Ruli and Muse, and a similar one from Wanding to Kyoyok, both built in 1992, which later locally began to be known as gun bridges. By the 1990s or up to 2000s, in fact, there were engineers and civil engineers who were visiting the ports in Myanmar already. So in one of the articles, it's written that by 2000, there were inspectors already in Chokpu port, which actually was later signed in 2007. And we know that the City Group won the contract. So these were plannings that were going on in the early 90s, which later were implemented. And besides the dams that were being built, obviously the Mitsuone Dam was suspended. Again, it's not been cancelled. So we are yet to see maybe the November elections and how things go. The influence matters when infrastructure is doing well. Definitely, it shows that there is more influence that China has. Whereas if a port or project or a dam project is cancelled, you indicate that, okay, China is probably having less influence in that sense, because they have started to take their own decisions. Myanmar has introduced a project bank very lately. They are now, they have put in place a project bank which actually does a proper, they had issues like Dr. Marwah said, that they do not really trust the BRI to do well. So they did have a project bank in Myanmar where they decide what kind of projects they want to other countries to invest in. Similarly, Japan is coming in a big way in Myanmar as well. India is trying its luck to trying to get the Kaladan project completed, and so on and so forth. But just coming to the conclusion that there is one big project, the CMEC, which was again, we were very confused at whether it's a part of the BRI or not. So these confusions are emerging as and when you realize that they want less influence of China. Even in political matters, there is either a cancellation or a suspension of projects or things like that. And when China is politically also doing well, these projects suddenly come in. This year in 2020 January, we had Xi Jinping visit the country after almost 19 years, done by president after 19 years. And 33 MOUs were signed, out of which 13 were to do with infrastructure, which obviously sort of shows that infrastructure is one of the biggest tools of influence today. And in terms of projects also, the amount of money that's going in is so big that, yes, I'm just concluding, just the same point, repeating the same point, that how infrastructure is today a tool of influence, and exactly through influence, infrastructure is being invested in, and it's the same way infrastructure investment equal to more influence. With this, I would end my talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shrabana. You know, a lot of what you say, we experience it in Malaysia as well. I'm not too sure if you follow. It's interesting that you mentioned the Straits of Malacca. I'm actually from Malacca, and in the Straits of Malacca, my town Malacca itself is the most narrow bit of the strait, and it's become of very strategic importance. And there are a lot of investment by China in my hometown also, and that has also drawn a lot of geopolitical interest from the West and China and others in terms of both commercial infrastructure and also geopolitical and strategic importance. Let's continue this conversation during the Q&A. Let's move on to our third speaker in the interest of time, so that we could finish off within the time that is allocated. And we have Dr. Athulasiri Kumara Samarakoon, a senior lecturer in politics and IR at the Open University of Sri Lanka. Athulasiri's title for today's presentation is Impossibility or Possibility of Neutrality or Lack of Commitment, Understanding Sri Lanka Foreign Policy Towards Major Powers in Post-War Period. Okay, the floor is yours, Athulasiri. Go ahead. You have to unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Chang. And I need to share my presentation with you. So I will share my screen now, right?
Okay, go ahead.
Right, is that okay? Right. So I think my title is very clear. Impossibility or possibility of neutrality or lack of commitment, understanding Sri Lanka's foreign policy towards major powers during the post-war period, that is after 2009. You all know that Sri Lanka had a bitter ethnic war, and it ended violently in 2009. So that is the starting point for this research. This is the content of my discussion. Traditional major powers. We'll have a look at briefly who the traditional major powers that Sri Lanka associated historically, and then go to understand the post-war realignments of power relations. And I'm asking a question whether Sri Lanka deviated from neutrality or not. And there's another theme, gambling for survival under anarchy, and possibility or impossibility of neutrality, and neutrality as a politico-ethical problem. So these are the content in my discussion. So some of the traditional major powers, all the researchers I think have focused in their foreign policy studies when it comes to Sri Lankan studies, India, UK, US, Russia, previously called USSR, and People's Republic of China. So they are the traditional major powers that Sri Lanka mainly focused when it comes to its foreign policy. And however, the nature and the extent and the depth of the relations with powers depended much on the ruling regimes and their declared policies, but most crucially on the incentives or disincentives from the polarity. I mean the bipolarity or unipolarity. For instance, from 1948 to 1956, there was the United National Party government, which had closer links with UK as a member of the Commonwealth and the West. And it hated communism, but had a trade, very interestingly, had a trade pact, rice and rubber pact with China. I would say that that is an effect of bipolarity. So from 1956 to 1977, there were 4 governments, and the declared policy was non-alignment, and SLF, the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, and its coalitions closely followed India, USSR, and China then. And from 1977 to 1994, there was a tilt towards the West. Basically, J.R. Jawaharlal was nicknamed as Yankee Dicky with his very close ties with the USA and earning India's suspicion. And there was the beginning of the ethnic war in that decade in 80s, and India intervened at times violently, and Sri Lanka was subjugated at certain points, and Sri Lanka was made to pressurized to ink Indo-Lanka Accord in 1987. And also there was armed struggle in the country, and there were huge human rights violations, etc. And Sri Lankan foreign policy faced a lot of challenges from democratic powers during this period. And from 1994 to 2005, there was United People's Progressive Alliance under Mrs. Bandaranaike Jr. And there was again realignment of relations with India, EU, and USA. And that government got the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Elam banned in several countries and considered that as a success of its foreign policy. And from 2005 to 2009, now again we have the same government, but under a different family, clan again, called Rajapaksa. And its domestic policy was war against the LTT, the Tamil militants. And India and USA during this time was seemingly not adding much pressure on Sri Lanka. And also the global war on terrorism certainly provoked the ethnic war to reach a violent end. And from 2009 onwards, China plays a pivotal role in Sri Lanka's development. So we come to this infrastructure parts again in Sri Lanka now, ports and highway infrastructure and other constructions, investments on industrial zones, etc. And Sri Lanka approves BNR initiative, and India becomes cautious this time usually, as usual, and warns, etc., but keeps funding, rehabilitating projects, and India continued its investment, etc. Post 2009 realignment of power relations, Rajapaksa government declared that war between the LTT and the Sri Lankan military ended on 19th May 2009. And military defeat of the LTT surfaced or brought several other challenges for Sri Lanka. For instance, development of economy, infrastructure, and provision of welfare, and facing the allegations of human rights violations and charges on alleged crimes during war and rehabilitation of war-torn areas. So they were the major challenges locally the Rajapaksa government were facing, and it required a lot of international support. And in the new context of changing domestic power in favor of Rajapaksa-led political alliance, supremacy of a majoritarian Sinhalese power was very much a likelihood. In 2010, Rajapaksa was re-elected as the president for a second term with much euphoria of revival of Sinhala Buddhist nationalism. So in the post-war period after 2009, the new major power Sri Lanka relations may show the following order under Rajapaksa's particularly. India. So first preference would be India under any government, I would say. India being the immediate neighbor, and the historical and cultural or emotional relations we have a lot of with India, and there's a deep political economic cooperation and soft power of Hindi cinema, music, etc. have a very deep relations with the public. So with all these things, India becomes the immediate concern in our foreign policy under any government. So the second is China. So China became the leading infrastructure developer during the post-war period, and it financed a lot of economic and development projects and provided political leverage in the international forums, developing cultural educational diplomacy, and also China became a new trend among foreign policy elite, particularly with those who with an Asian worldview and who argue that the Asian century is right now with us now. So then third power will be USA, which is the backbone of export economy of Sri Lanka, and which Sri Lanka has a lot of diplomatic and political influence on foreign political and economic policy challenges. And closely, Sri Lanka works with closely USA works with Sri Lanka in democracy and its civil society elements. So, and fourthly, we have EU, because that is also a larger export destination, and it also have a lot of political influence on Sri Lanka, basically in promoting democracy and having influence on domestic policy, etc. Domestic policy in terms of our sharing, etc. And much important for Sri Lanka because EU is very important when it comes to the international public opinion on Sri Lanka's ethnic issue. And lastly, there will be always Japan and Russia as destination of aid, donations, economic and political and diplomatic influence. So I would say during the post-war period, the new major powers are India, China, US, EU, and Japan. So let's move on. And has Sri Lanka deviated from neutrality? Because Sri Lanka, from the beginning, post-independence, Sri Lanka declared its policy is neutrality. But today, there is very less talk about neutrality because no power in the region actually talk about neutrality, neither India nor other country. And world does not experience today bloc politics as such, as I would say, because it happened during the Cold War. Yet there is new Cold War between the West and China as we see it now. This power rivalry is the main thing which mostly characterizes the polarity today. So power transition in favor of Asia and the relative decline of West has created an uneasy situation for small states, particularly when there's again a military competition in the Indian Ocean region where Sri Lanka is a strategically important state. And now we see that there is a multipolar world emerging in the world. So Sri Lanka often assures other powers, particularly India, that Sri Lanka would would not allow major powers to use its soil for military purposes. But despite all these pledges, assurances, what has really happened is the following, because already major powers are there, well settled in Sri Lanka. So these are some examples. Sri Lanka signed AXA, Acquisition of Cross Services Agreement in 2007 and back in 2017, and a status of Forces Agreement recently with the USA. And Millennium Challenge Cooperation Agreement is being negotiated with the USA right now. And secondly, Sri Lanka signed the lease agreement for Hambantota Harbour, another 15,000 acres along with it, with China for 99 years in 2017. And China currently builds an elegant financial city in Colombo in an artificial land created in sea attached to Colombo Fort. And thirdly, when it comes to India, India has acquired much of Sri Lanka's oil tank complex in the strategic port in Trincomalee in the east. India helped to develop Jaffna's Malaya port. Colombo Port's Easter Terminal project given to both India and Japan. But the project is put on hold currently. So these agreements and infrastructure developments have well brought the major powers back into the scene in Sri Lanka. So there's a lot of gambling in Sri Lankan foreign policy because the government's policy is to certainly balance each other. So multipolarity offers incentives, but states need to carefully choose them. In an anarchical and competitive world order, survival is extremely difficult for small states. The political interests of major powers are harder when a small state is more vulnerable economically and otherwise. Management of neighbors' suspicion and escaping pressure and influence of extra-regional powers simultaneously needs a balanced approach. During the post-war period, 2019, 2015, 2020, Sri Lankan governments have in a way attempted to bargain with its strategic assets, but mostly failed to make a win-win situation due to regime-specific problems. And uh, as a result, survival of the state is in great danger from a traditional sovereignties point of view and dependency perspective. India, China, USA, Russia, UK, EU in post-independence period during bipolarity have worked with Sri Lanka with greater understanding and care for its independence, territorial integrity, and sovereignty. But the multipolar world today has seemingly given rise to huge competition among major powers, and hence there's a threat to the ethical policy on their part as well. So greatest option for Sri Lanka and small states would be to become friend of all and be neutral, but there is greater impossibility of defining neutrality in the current context, as the political structure, I would mean power, does not demand for neutrality. Because neither India nor other powers demand neutrality today, because they have been during the non-alignment period, India demanded neutrality from Sri Lanka. So neutrality as a political-ethical problem. So that is my philosophical issue in this research. So neo-realism argues that states in anarchy attempts to survive. Yet the recent past shows well that external balancing is not something that Sri Lanka should look for. Survival attempts opens space for violence. The opening to a future makes a new life possible while exposing everything that lives to finitude and the threat of erasure. What could be the, can I go for 1 minute?
Yeah, you got 2 more minutes to go. Yeah.
Right, thank you. Right. So what could be the ethics of politics of survival? Can the can the archaic Panchsheel, middle path, non-alignment, disarmament, Indian Ocean peace zone, etc., as constructs of the past have any effect for future when all powers engage in competition for hegemony? Neutrality is a necessary condition for small states, but also the most difficult condition when the structure does not support it. Yet an ethical approach to foreign relations should be the policy of the whole world, and the COVID-19 is reaching us, bringing us that lesson today, right now. However, actors' commitment for such a neutral and ethical policy would be more important than relative gains sans ethics. So these are my references. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Athulasiri. This is, again, I'm not too sure whether you are aware of, I'm sure you are aware that ASEAN also struggles with this, our doctrine called ASEAN neutrality. It is something that ASEAN struggles to find a balance between the two powers, and we are constantly under pressure by both the powers to take sides. And we keep saying that we do not want to take sides, but we are constantly in this midst of pressure from both sides. And this is something I think for us in Malaysia and ASEAN fully understand the kind of dynamics that you're going through in Sri Lanka as well. Let's have more conversation on this during the Q&A. Thanks again. Okay, now we have our last speaker today. It's Monaj Das, who is an assistant professor, Center for Southeast Asian Studies at Guwahati University of India. Monaj is going to present to us his paper titled Intrastate Water Discords and Federal Tensions in Pakistan. Monaj, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Chair, Chang, for chairing the session, and all the panel speakers for the very interesting presentations on different topics, from infrastructure projects and India-Myanmar relations and India's presence in ASEAN and all. So my topic is on intrastate conflicts or intrastate water conflicts in Pakistan, and how it is actually creating tensions for the federal relations in Pakistan. I'm not having any presentation or PowerPoint slides because I believe that PowerPoint presentation kills more time. So I will go an extempore presentation. As it is said that the present century, it is of more of a non-traditional security conflicts age or century, because the traditional conflicts have been declined continuously, and the major intrastate conflicts have taken a major forefront in the present century. So likewise, the case in Pakistan is not an exception in that case, because we see Pakistan has its domestic ramifications for terrorism, and some other issues like water related issues has its own domestic ramifications. So I will mainly focus on how the water issues is creating major tensions in the federal system in Pakistan. We see that there are lots of predictions from World Bank and other agencies wherein predictions has been made that the Pakistan is continuously the groundwater and the river water is continuously declining, and now it is believed that by 2025 Pakistan has been now the situation is Pakistan is considered as a water stressed country, but over the years, or maybe after 2025, it will have the status of a water scarce country, because there will be water scarcity in all the provinces, be it seen where the major rivers originate or the river passes through, but ramifications can be seen in all the Pakistani provinces. So with that, I'm not go into much information or detail about the statistics and all, but I will just try to focus on the major causes and what actually has caused the federal tensions related to water issues in Pakistan. The first one is definitely it's a global problem, that is climate change. Climate change is creating tremendous havoc in terms of depleting the water resources throughout the world. And the South Asia and especially Asia has been a major victim of that, because we are at the transition phase in terms of development. We are actually sacrificing our natural resources. So climate change is a major cause, but it is called as a villain for water scarcity in Pakistan. But the second major villain is the over-centralization of federal government in Pakistan. In terms of Ian Talbot's terminology, he has coined the term Punjabization of Pakistan. That is the over-centralization of Punjab province, where that is the capital city, capital province that controls the other provinces. So I will discuss this factor in later discussions. There are other factors like rising population and rapid urbanization in Pakistan, especially in the cities like Karachi, Islamabad. Then dependence on groundwater irrigation systems, that is a major issue in many of the third world countries, and especially in India also, we are dependent on the irrigation projects. Okay. Then these water confrontations in Pakistan, it actually predates since its inception. It is the water tensions can be seen in the post 1947 period also. There were commissions constituted by the British India government, like in 1925. Then in 1945 there were Rao Commission to resolve the water discords in Pakistan. But this water discord actually it became a major debatable issue in the post-partition or after the creation of Pakistan. There were commissions in the post-partition period also, like 1964, 1961 commissions were there. But the major controversy is related to sharing of the Indus river that Pakistan, after the Indus Water Treaty of 1960 September, Pakistan actually has gained control over 3 rivers on the eastern side. These are like Jhelum, then Chenab, and Indus, whereas India got the control over Ravi, Vyas, and Satluj. So there, the Sindh provinces and other provinces, they alleges that the there is over centralization of the Pakistan's capital city, or that is Punjab, Punjabization of Pakistan, there, because it was believed that the water in Indus Water Treaty of 1970, all the provinces were not party to the treaty. Only Punjab represented there in the treaty. So the Sindh believed that Punjab already represented their own interest. They sacrificed the interest of the other provinces at their own cost by forefronting their own interest. So this is the Indus Water Treaty is a major confrontation, though it has actually resolved the in India Pakistan water interboundary water issues, but it has actually created major tensions in internal politics of Pakistan, because all the provinces, they don't have any consensus in terms of water sharing inside Pakistan, in terms of resource sharing and all. So Sindh believes that the major confrontation we can see from among or between the Punjab province and Sindh province, because Sindh province believe that the major water resources that actually lies in their territory, but the majority of the maximum utilization is made in the Punjab province. So we can see major tensions after the 1960 treaty. But there were after 1963 there were other arrangements were made, ad hoc arrangements were made in Pakistan, but the major treaty was like 1991 treaty that is called that is for water apportionment agreement, just to redress the provincial grievances, like they were not part of the Indus Water Treaty in 1960. So the government tried to console these provinces' interest, but and they were made part of this agreement. All the 4 provinces were part of the agreement of 1991, that is called Water Apportionment Agreement, and they gave consent to all the provisions and clauses of the agreement. But the problem lies in their implementation, because whatever provisions were recorded or written down in the agreement, in letter and spirit, the Pakistani capital city has not followed it. I would like to point out some provisions of the agreement. Like the 1991 Water Apportionment Accord, it says that it superseded all previous water sharing arrangements and agreements which were there before the inception of the country or after the formation of the country. And it protects the existing uses of canal water in each province. Then it recognizes the need for construction of new water reservoirs and infrastructure for on Indus River and other rivers for agricultural development. Then it recognizes the need to establish an Indus River System Authority as an implementing agency and monitoring agency to look after the implementation of the accord. And it also recognizes the need to have certain amount of water discharge from the barrages or the reservoirs to the downstream. But we see just after the signing of this agreement, there was resentment from the parties, the provinces, because of the implementation part. Because though there were clauses or provisions, but Pakistani central government has not implemented the provisions at all, and they actually carried on the same spirit of 1970 provisions. For example, the charge of like the provision for the need for certain minimum escape of sea water from the reservoirs to the sea below Kotri to sea intrusion, for which further studies are to be undertaken. What happens? There is a provision under the 1991 agreement under which the central government is mandated to release certain amount of water so that the river doesn't get dry. But what happened in the implementation stage, they have not release the minimum minimum amount of decided water that was to be released by the government, and as a result of this, it has severely affected the coastal population, like their livelihoods are at stake, and the rivers near Karachi, they are drying up, they are not forming any delta. So there are intrusions of seawater into the freshwater areas. Like freshwater areas are also becoming now saline water. So it is drying up their freshwater lakes. It is the seawater is making their soil saline. They are less productive, and it is severely affecting the mangrove forest that lies in the coastal areas. So there are heavy resentments among the provinces. Especially, we can see the the three provinces: this Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, then this Balochistan province, and Sindh province. They are leveling their or they are portraying their allegations or resentment against one province, that is the Punjab province. So these are the major resentments. Then there are also like Khyber Pakhtunkhwa believes that the Punjab government or Punjab province is still using the traditional or the 150 years old canal system that actually results in excessive water wastage, because we need to develop modern infrastructure in for irrigation projects and all, but the Punjab region, it is still using the traditional irrigation projects and all. So there are heavy resentments from the other provinces, and how to resolve these issues, and these resentments are getting represented in terms of ethnic clashes also. Like we can see Balochistan provinces resentment against or ethnic tensions against the central government. They are trying to bargain their own interest related to water issues also. Yes, sir?
You got 2 minutes.
Yes, sir. So how to resolve the issues? First is there is a need to engage all the community stakeholders, like NGOs you have to cover, then academia, then research agencies we have to cover. Then sustainable agricultural practices have to be taken into consideration. More scientific and sociological studies need to be conducted, because only such scientific studies cannot resolve all the issues. There should be sociological studies also to understand the ground realities, what the population or the local people are having or facing from this construction projects and all. And there is a need to initiate a sensitization drive through textbooks in schools and colleges, because we see that there is overemphasis on teaching or imparting the idea and ideology of Pakistan. That is the state ideology. But we see the modern, the new problems are cropping up. So there is a need to modify the textbook also, so that the new generations can be given a proper education to tackle with the upcoming problems. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Manoj. Yes, you know, there's always this saying right now that water is going to be the 21st century.
Yes, sir.
Oil, isn't it? Countries will go into conflict because of water. And in your case, apparently it's interesting, it's an intrastate tension that is the reason out of this difficulty. Here in ASEAN, I think Mekong River, the crisis is more of an interstate rather than intrastate, but there are parallels, I think, between the two. Maybe we could pick that up afterwards during our discussion. Now, we've got about 30 minutes for Q&A, and I'm just waiting if there's any question coming through from the organizers. If not, then if we have some time, then we could even have a round of questions and then perhaps have a conversation between the speakers, the presenters ourselves. So if we want to have a more dynamic conversation, we could perhaps make our questions a bit more concise and also our responses a little bit more concise, so that we have a few rounds of dialogue so that we could ask one another some questions arisen from our presentation. Perhaps I would like just to more broadly general to the three or the four speakers here, because in some ways we addresses the ASEAN thing as well. I'm interested to know, how do you guys see ASEAN? Because Athulasiri has spoken about neutrality, and then we have ASEAN neutrality, and Reena speaks about ASEAN caught in the middle between the two powers. And Shrabana too, in some ways, addresses the Myanmar dilemma, caught facing this big China power in play now. Where does ASEAN stand? Is ASEAN an effective bloc? Do they have the kind of bargaining power? Do they actually able to maintain the kind of neutrality that they advocate? And I want to put this in the context of the Indo-Pacific strategy. And where do you see ASEAN seeing itself? Have they responded to the overtures for this Indo-Pacific strategy? Let me start with maybe Reena will go first, and then Shrabana, and then Athulasiri, and then Monish, if you have some take on this, please chip in. Okay, Reena, go ahead.
Thank you,
yes.
Professor Chang, and thank you to all the speakers also. And since we haven't got questions from the chat, I think it's good that you initiated this discussion. Where ASEAN is Indo-Pacific in 2020 in comparison to, say a year or two ago when this, several meetings and formal engagements have happened. But certainly, I think what I have understood is that ASEAN does not want to look at any structural grouping as being, as being seen as containing China. So they are sensitive to that fact, and they don't want it to be viewed as a containment strategy of China. They want it to be an all-inclusive, kind of framework to the extent possible. The situation is changing, it's transforming very, very fast. And every country is, being kind of forced to align with one or the other. And if you're with us, then you're not with them, sort of kind of paradigm, which every country has to try and negotiate and navigate through. But China, of course, has done very well with its bilateral engagement, because even if you look at the FTA, even if you look at any kind of agreement which they have, broadly with a grouping, they always prefer to deal with each country bilaterally. And that bilateral engagement, every country is very, very sensitive of. A few days ago, I had some interview with the Vietnamese also, and they also said that, we cannot come out of that Chinese grip, so to say, and we cannot be seen as being anti-China. So none of the countries in the region want to see the Indo-Pacific as a containment strategy, to contain China. That's for sure.
Shrabana, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll put my discussion into this whole infrastructure, Myanmar and China perspective when I'm talking about ASEAN. So Myanmar, as we know, joined ASEAN in 1997. If we speak about ASEAN neutrality and come to the question of, do you think Myanmar is being neutral now or trying to avoid a tussle between especially India and China, if not Japan? There are many questions raised on this front, whether Myanmar is a playing ground for these big powers, whether Myanmar can remain neutral, is it trying to even remain neutral, or is it actually encouraging these big powers to come and play in their backyard? So just to come to a more scholarly discussion, we have Bertil Lintner, who is a prominent writer on Myanmar. He speaks about the fact that back in 1990s itself, it was a vassal state. It was a state where a Sinicization had already happened. Professor Swaran Singh also had written an article saying it's already Sinicized in terms of having not just infrastructure, all kinds of things I've already spoken about. But today, when we look at so many projects being cancelled, and the fact that today we have to recognize that it is a sort of democracy, that is, it has some sort of an agency of its own. Not just China is, it's not a puppet anymore in the hands of China that it can play through. So in that sense, is Myanmar still neutral to that great power game? Renaud Igreto had said that it cannot, China and India particularly cannot use Myanmar as a field because Myanmar has its own agency. There are others, some like Mohan Malik, for example, says that probably it's not really, nobody can use Myanmar, but at the same time, Myanmar is itself facilitating these great power games. It's letting countries in so that it does not get into that grip of China. So that literally also then converts to whether a state like Myanmar can remain neutral, if not ASEAN as a whole, to Chinese influence or say a great power influence. So I think that if we come to Indonesia, for example, which is such a big player in ASEAN, it also talked about that global maritime fulcrum that we have to let the global maritime fulcrum was initiated by Indonesia based on 5 pillars. One was, of course, infrastructure connectivity. But the point that these initiatives keep coming in where the attempt is that ASEAN keeps moving in that direction where it is not really taken over just by China. So China is not the only country who is going to talk about infrastructure and BRI. There has to be a discussion on maritime connectivity and transport connectivity that ASEAN has to initiate with or without China. So I think we have to look at this neutrality in terms of ASEAN trying to make these discussions at multilateral forums, which then countries individually are also taking up at bilateral forums. Thank you.
Thank you. Athulasiri, you want to add something to it? Unmute, please. We can't hear you.
I think here what we are concerned about, whole issue about international cooperation, not the conflict dimension of it, because as it states, whether small or big or medium sized, I think we all have to survive ultimately. I think that is the message that this COVID has given to us today. So there's a big message there. So when it comes to ASEAN, I think ASEAN is a big success story when it comes to regional groupings, more than South Asian Regional Organization. I think ASEAN has been able to, do something for their people and uplift the living conditions in that region. So in that context, I think ASEAN has more to gain from the rise of big powers in Asia, because this India and China, I don't think there is I don't like to sort of use the realistic jargon, because I am also trained in JNU, SIS, where all my professors are realist philosophers. But I would say we need to discover a humanist realist language today. It's all about to reinvent international politics, because to reuse the similar language in the new context of changing power, I don't think that will be good for humanity per se, because after all we have one planet, and we all know that now ecologically, environmentally, we are facing a lot of issues now when it comes to this infrastructure development in the world, in building artificial islands everywhere, and there are a lot of issues actually, and building, and also in the arms race, arms competition, there are a lot of issues, and we have suffered. I think the 20th century has given us enough lessons if we, as scholars, can get together and discuss. philosophically, 20th century has given us enough lessons, enough sufferings to rethink whether we want the same kind of realism when in the new century, because we know it is going to be a multipolar world, and India, China, US, all are competing in this region. That's a reality. So the structure is that there's a power structure in which the powers are competing for their hegemonic places. So that may be a natural thing, because in a structure it can happen, but how to certainly give us ethical flavor to that, because we all the countries, all the states have to have a say voice, because it's all more than, I mean, any other century. It's a democratic world in a way. We are more towards democracy, and we have a lot of multilateral forums, and we can negotiate anything. I think discussion is the ultimate thing that we can have as humanity today, because not the weapon. So once you go to touch the weapon first, and forgetting all humanity and everything that we have developed throughout the century, I think there again we are going back to barbarism, the tribal age. So there is no need today for us to go back to the barbarism, but to how to cooperate in this world. Because now in Sri Lanka, China is developing harbors, and first in Sri Lanka invited India to develop harbors, but due to some issues, India did not accept that. But now China has developed and got the harbor on lease. So there is a cooperation between China and Sri Lanka somehow. Some agreement is there. But this can be looked at from different angles. For a realist, for a hardcore realist, for an offensive realist, this would in future be used for military purposes. Definitely it can be used. Definitely it can be used. Whether there's a harbor or not, definitely Sri Lanka can be used for military purpose if there is a very aggressive actor. So if there are aggressive actors, what is option for small states? There are no option for small states if all the actors are aggressive. So we need to rethink of the middle ground, I think. So,
thank you, Athulasiri. Thank you. Manoj, do you want to say anything on this? Yes, go ahead.
Just very few comments from my side. You see that the present the scenario or the contemporary world politics is it's a multilateralism. We see one country is part of one bloc, then it has membership in other blocs also. So I believe in multilateral world, the liberal and realist this interests go hand in hand. It coexist together. So I believe that if ASEAN members countries or few countries of the ASEAN, they take one on one side or in one platform, but they take another side on the other platform. So it depends on their individual interest as well as on the bloc interest as well. So I think neutrality we can expect in some aspect, but their own interest also matters. Like we see ASEAN has been, in some cases, there are countries like countries which are pro-Chinese also, but there are countries which are pro Southeast Asia or South Asia countries also. We see a greater cooperation on the Indian side, like under the Act East policy, we are having tremendous cooperation in terms of cultural sector, opening up of economic sectors like road and infrastructure and the flight services and all. So we see a blend of both realist and liberal interest in international world for politics now.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I just want to pick up on some points that Dr. Athulasiri has already mentioned, and Shrabana. I just want to say that also all the other fellow speakers, that this is a multi-polar world now, and we are in a global situation. It's kind of a democracy. Every country, no matter how big or small, you do have a vote, to have a voice, a vote at the UN. And Shrabana did say that small countries like us do have some agencies. We are not completely subservient to these big powers. Yes. And Shrabana says that sometimes we invite the big powers, we play out the two big powers to our own advantage. So our former prime minister famously said that, I think he's just raising some concern that China's rise is going to be another form of colonialism, but it's not the kind of outright full military colonialism, but with the economic colonialism that sort of brings out the image of subjugation. You know, small countries will be indebted to these big powers, and to some degree, small countries are inevitably we have to operate within the shadow of big powers. But this is in the 21st century, as Dr. Athulasiri raises that we do have certain agency. We do have rooms in which we can maneuver. Our destiny is not completely surrendered out to the superpowers. I want to bring this conversation right now. What we are concerned about in ASEAN right now, especially in South China Sea, and maybe Reena can expound on that, because you did raise it in your presentation about the South China Sea, that we may be caught into a conflict that we do not want to be a part of. You know, we are small countries. We are always concerned that we become pawns of these big power conflicts in South China Sea. How do you guys see the situation right now in the South China Sea, and then leading up to the November election? Is this a really dangerous time for us, or are there room for optimism that sober heads or clearer heads will prevail, that we can avoid an outright conflict? Reena, go ahead.
Well, in my opinion, what we have seen of China is that even the June 15th incident is considered, as something odd. And that is why they have not even accepted that, formally. And they want to keep that in a state of denial. And because they want to nibble away at areas without having to fire a shot. That is what my understanding is.
What is the June 15 incident? Can you?
The June 14th night, when 20 soldiers, Indian soldiers,
oh yes,
were killed
of course, yes.
The confrontation, because China has been on our borders in north and northeast. Yes, they have been there since 7th of May. And this is now 17 weeks that they have been on our borders, and there is no sign of disengagement. In fact, they are also preparing for, the airstrikes, and that is the latest information. But China seeks to win without firing a shot as far as it can help, and that is what we have seen even for India, like last 45 years. They do not really want to change the status quo. But this time India has shown, it's kind of standing up to the China challenge. And that is why, there is this kind of increasing belligerence, aggressiveness, threatening. So if we have to take a leaf out of the Himalayas episode and the experience that we are going through and take it to the South China Sea. There again, China would not really want to see even a small kind of conflict erupting. And I think we all recognize the interdependence between China and the United States. There is huge interdependence, the more than $450 billion trade, between the United States and China with a huge trade surplus. And even if that declines, both countries lose. It's not that just one country loses. So the kind of interdependence that there is now among countries and between countries, there obviously cannot be a Cold War of the kind that existed earlier before 1990. So therefore, it's extremely important to understand that the United States, in its pivot to Asia, wants to be seen as a power, the biggest power, and it wants to, and it has been an ally of the Philippines and other countries as well, like Thailand as well. So therefore, it doesn't want to take its eyes off, and China is challenging it in every sphere. But as far as China is concerned, my hunch is that it will not want to see a full war through. and therefore it will want to continue its engagement, because the economic engagement must continue for China's own growth as well. And it again, you know, if you look at the ASEAN-China trade, the way the trade deficit among ASEAN countries is increasing with China. China is the one which is hugely benefit of trade with ASEAN countries, and the trade deficits, you know, with China for ASEAN are increasing. So therefore, and China knows that it can win without firing a shot. In 2020, its four largest are the four largest of the world. Further, you know, sort of solidified their position. They own $14 trillion. You know, that's their capital assets for four banks only. I'm not talking about the other banks. So, I mean, that's the kind of economic power that China has, and we need to recognize it. But of course, it does understand that its military power is still, you know, not exactly equivalent to the United States, and it will take some time before it does become so. Yeah,
thank you, Reena. Thanks. Shrabana, go ahead.
So talking about, you had a point about the elections and how probably we are going to look at US elections and how China is going to respond. But before coming to that, I think because of Shinzo Abe's resignation, we will have to also see who is coming in Japan now. Because the whole idea about US in this part of the world, in the Indo-Pacific particularly, is in a very realist sense hinged on the Quad and just the military part of it, obviously. So who comes in Japan also, I think, will impact how China looks at US and elections and so on and so forth. Having said that, if we come to the South China Sea dispute, like Dr. Marwah has already mentioned or quoted Professor Mehbubani's book about how a small war probably could be expected only regarding the South China Sea, where again we have to remember that Philippines, Singapore and Indonesia has sort of concluded a maritime boundary agreement in 2014. So they have made their legal documents ready in case there is something. So if China is to come out in the South China Sea more aggressively, then ultimately these are small countries or smaller countries like Philippines will take a stand, because it's the direct impact would be with Philippines, even to an extent with Japan. So we have to see what these countries are doing, and maybe not very, we tend to ignore these small agreements, but they will have an impact on how China is going to play their game in South China Sea. That's, I think, about it, about how we are going to look at generally this part of the world and US's stance in it. Talking about India, China, I think Dr. Marwah has already covered, and I agree with most of it. What somehow bothers me is, of course, the fact that there has been a gnawing of China on India's territory, to the extent that now even Nepal does claim a part of the Lipu Lake area. So, of course, this is a concerning matter for India, at least. And I had done some study on the dispute that's there between India and Pakistan, and a part of that is now coming back to haunt us, because China has come in so close to that part of the territory. We also have to remember that Pakistan has already ceded a part of the Shasgam Valley to China in 1963. So of course these matter does bother India, and how everything plays out. I mean, not in the post-COVID world per se, because I feel that the world order it did not suddenly change because of COVID, but it had already started changing. Of course, how COVID catalyzes some of it matters, but not so much. So that's about it on just generic points that I wanted to put forth.
Thank you, Shrabana. Dr. Samara, you want to add something to this?
What is the role of small states in the emerging new world order? So I would say if the history future is going to be so chaotic as we have seen it in the past under past bipolar worlds. So are we imagining the same bipolar world that we had in the past? So that is the problem, because we see everything through the prism of realism, actually. So now we are imagining that the same world will reappear before us, like what we had before Second World War, First World War, etc. So that is one kind of imagination, actually. So the way we imagine the world is also a part of the issue, actually. So not the amount of power, the influence that one can generate on the region, on the world. So that is another part. But also, on the other hand, the imagination is another issue, because we all the time, if you imagine an enemy and enemy attacks, and so that's part of the issue as well. So I want to I want to explore a new kind of realism, new language of realism, maybe Chinese realism or Indian realism. So because in Asiatic world, we also have a kind of realism, which could be different from American Western realism. Because we have not been trained to get an eye for eye. So that is a different philosophy. So we have Mahatma Gandhi's, Buddha's, and in China, Confucius. So we are a different territory, different people. So in that context, how do we have a universal realism even when we can't have a universal democracy? So we have to seriously, I think, discuss these issues as scholars, I think. So power game will continue, because these powers, whether we like or not, they will keep fighting and they will learn lessons or not. And ultimately the people will suffer, because in South Asia, ultimately the suffering lot are the people. Now with the COVID and all, our poor people are dying. Most of our poor people are dying in this region. So, but the power game is continuing. So, but as scholars and as academics, I think our one duty that is on our shoulders is to develop a new language, new philosophy to pacify the world. Because if we also keep tuning the same philosophy, which actually ultimately develops into another world war kind of situation, I think there would not be, we won't be able to see another world in some 20, 30 years time. So there won't be, so we want to discover all the possibilities to save the world for the posterity. So that is my humble opinion.
Thank you, Dr. Samarakoon. Thank you. Are we running out of time? Manoj, are you still with us? We have about a minute for you. Manoj, are you there?
Yes, sir, I'm here.
You got 1 minute, yes.
Sir, I don't have much understanding on the South China Sea issue, because that is not my area of specialization. But your question on the this river construction, the dam construction projects in Pakistan and how it is related to China. So I was just recalling that moment because recently in 2020 itself, in Gilgit-Baltistan area of that is in Pakistan occupied Kashmir, that already some parts has been given by Pakistan to China. So the river project was started, or it was documented in 2001, but recently Pakistan has given a partnership to China in terms of 70-30 ratio. So there is heavy resentment against these CPEC projects. It is part of CPEC, somehow it is related, but initially it was started by Pakistan itself. It was not part of Chinese project, but in 2020 it has been given to China in terms of providing funds. Like 70% fund will be given by China. But there are heavy resentment from Gilgit-Baltistan people, because they believe that they are actually encroaching their land on their land rights, the rights of the Gilgit-Baltistan people, because they believe that their interests are not taken into consideration by the central government. And so they need to actually focus, or they need to take into board all the interests of the people, be it in the extreme corner or in the center. That's my belief.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Manoj, for bringing in this dimension, the water issue that is rarely touched on. Thank you so much. We're running out of time. Thank you, Reena. Thank you, Dr. Samarakoon and Dr. Shrabana and also Monej. I learned a great deal from you all. I'm sure we will meet again in this webinar circuit by NIICE sometime in the near future. All right.
Thank you,
So take
sir.
care now, everybody, and I'll pass the floor back to Rafia now.
Yes, thank you for all the panelists for the interesting this lecture.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Peter.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Jaiswal.
Distinguished Chair, ladies and gentlemen, as we come to the end of the session, I take great honor in proposing the vote of thanks on behalf of the NIICE to all who have graced us with their presence and contributed their parts to make this event a resounding success. We would like to express our profuse gratitude and sincere thanks to Dr. Peter for agreeing to chair and moderate the session today. Our sincere thanks also goes to all the speakers for being a part of the event and delivering such a comprehensive and convincing presentation. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Finally, I must also mention our deep sense of appreciation for the audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching us live on our YouTube channel. Thank you for your valuable time and attention and for making the session productive with your questions. We are truly honored to have had you all with us this evening and hope to stay connected with you in future as well. It's really been a pleasure. Also, do join at our next session. Thank you so much.